The advertisement sat on the kitchen table like an accusation. Harriet Bole stared at it while her mother's voice drifted in from the parlor, explaining to their neighbor Mrs. Fenwick, the real Mrs. Fenwick, the one from the list, the one who'd been attending church socials since before Harriet was born, exactly why her eldest daughter was still unmarried at 26. Practical, her mother was saying. Harriet's always been so terribly practical. The way she said it made practical sound like a disease. The advertisement had been her cousin Dorothea's idea. Dorothea, who had glossy auburn hair and a laugh that made men forget their own names, had torn it from the back pages of a gazette she'd brought up from Toronto. She'd waved it like a flag of surrender on Harriet's behalf. Rancher in the Alberta foothills. Widower. Seeking capable woman for marriage and household management. Serious inquiries only. Serious inquiries. Dorothea had nearly choked laughing. Can you imagine? Some poor sun-baked cowboy expecting a proper wife and getting our Harriet? The laughter was the worst part. Not cruel, exactly. Just careless. The laughter of people who have never had to take themselves seriously because the world has always done it for them. Harriet was not pretty. She had known this the way she knew the names of the provinces, the way she knew how to preserve fruit and mend a split seam, as simple, neutral fact. She had her father's jaw and her grandmother's eyes, both of which were perfectly fine features individually, but arranged together produced a face that people's gazes moved across without stopping. Brown hair, medium height, hands already roughened at 26 from the farm work her brothers had managed to avoid. Pleasant enough, a distant aunt had once offered, with the encouraging tone of someone describing a mediocre weather forecast. She had not expected anyone to answer. She had not expected to be the one who wrote. But she had at midnight, with the lamp turned low and her sisters asleep in the next room, she had pulled out a sheet of paper and written a single paragraph to the address in the advertisement. She said she could cook and preserve and manage a budget. She said she was good with children. She said she was not looking for romance. She said the arrangement he was proposing sounded sensible, and she was sensible. She signed her name. She walked to the post box at the end of the road before she could think better of it. 3 weeks later, a letter came addressed in a handwriting so spare it looked like the man had been conserving ink. Miss Bole, I received your letter. I'll be direct since you seem to prefer it. I'm 34. I run a cattle operation outside Milford Creek, Alberta. I have a daughter, age 8. My wife passed 4 years ago. I'm not offering love or courtship. I'm offering a home, fair treatment, and honest work. The winters are brutal. The nearest town is 11 miles, and the land will ask more of you than you think you have. If you understand that and still want to come, I'll send the train fare. Respectfully, Nathan Greer. Harriet read it 4 times. Then she sat in the kitchen where she'd washed dishes for 26 years and let herself cry, not from sadness, but from the bewildering shock of being taken seriously. He hadn't asked what she looked like. He hadn't asked what she brought as a dowry or whether her family was well connected. He had read her single honest paragraph and said yes. She told her mother over supper. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever happened in that kitchen. Her mother set down her fork with the careful precision of a woman buying time. Harriet, you cannot be serious. I've written back already. I told him I'd come. Dorothea, who was visiting for the week, looked between them with the bright, alarmed eyes of someone who had started a fire as a joke and was now watching it spread to the curtains. This is my fault, she said. It's my decision, Harriet said. You don't know this man, her mother said. You don't know anything about him. He could be violent, a drinker, he could be, Harriet agreed, and I could spend the next 40 years washing dishes in this kitchen and being described as pleasant enough at my own funeral. She pushed back her chair. I'm going. She'd never spoken to her mother that way in her life. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to grip the table to stand, but her voice had not wavered once, and she thought perhaps that was what courage actually felt like from the inside, terrified all the way through and moving anyway. She packed her trunk in 3 days. Practical clothing, sturdy boots, a copy of a book of Canadian poetry her father had given her before he passed. She left the good dress her mother had always saved for special occasions. She had a feeling that where she was going, special occasions looked different. The train from Ontario through the prairies took 4 days. Harriet watched the country change through the window, the farms giving way to flatland, the flatland becoming something vaster and more indifferent than she had words for. By the time the mountains appeared on the horizon, she felt she had crossed into another world entirely, one that did not know her name or her family's opinion of her prospects. She shared her compartment with an older woman traveling to visit a son in Lethbridge, who studied Harriet's face for a moment and then asked, not unkindly, "Is someone meeting you or are you headed somewhere on your own?" "Someone's meeting me." Harriet paused. "A man I haven't met. I'm to be his wife." The woman's eyebrows moved, but her expression stayed kind. "Mail order? We wrote letters.
The woman nodded slowly. My sister did something similar. 22 years ago. Moved out to Saskatchewan. The woman settled back in her seat. She's still there. Built something real. She looked at Harriet squarely. You look sensible. That matters more than people think, out here. Harriet held on to that the way you hold a candle in wind.
The station at Milford Creek was 4 planks and a roof. Harriet stepped down from the train into a cold that had an opinion about her, pressing through her coat like it was taking notes. She scanned the platform. 3 people waiting. An elderly man with a dog, a young woman collecting parcels, and then a figure apart from the others near the far end of the platform, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the October wind. She knew it was him the same way you know something in a dream, not from evidence, just from certainty. Nathan Greer was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way that comes from work rather than fashion, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in argument and never fully relaxed. His eyes, when he met hers, were the gray-green of a lake before a storm. He did not smile. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man assessing a situation, not a woman, and Harriet found she did not mind that at all. Miss Bole, Mr. Greer. They stood 2 feet apart in the cold Alberta wind and regarded each other. Long journey, he said. Long enough, she said. His mouth shifted slightly. Not a smile. The beginning of one considered and put away. He picked up her trunk, one-handed, without asking, and nodded toward a wagon and 2 horses waiting at the road's edge. The ride out to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. The road climbed through foothills that kept revealing more foothills behind them, each one larger than the last, the mountains beyond them so enormous they seemed drawn rather than real. Nathan drove in silence. Harriet did not try to fill it. She had always found silence more honest than conversation for its own sake. You're quieter than I expected, he said after the first hour. You expected something different? Most people talk when they're nervous. I am nervous, Harriet said. I just don't see how talking about nothing would help. He glanced at her. Something in his expression shifted again, rearranging itself into something she couldn't name. My daughter's name is Rosie, he said after a moment. She's 8. She's been with the Harmon family down the road while I came to collect you. She'll want to know if you're kind. I'd appreciate you letting her decide that for herself before you try to win her over. How do I do that? Don't try. He returned his eyes to the road. Kids know when they're being managed. Just be yourself and let her make up her own mind. And if she decides she doesn't like me, then we'll deal with that honestly. His hands were easy on the reins, competent and still. I promised Rosie I wouldn't pretend about anything. The ranch appeared over the last rise in the fading afternoon light. It was larger than Harriet had pictured. A solid 2-story house, weathered but sound, outbuildings spread around it in a practical arrangement, fencing that stretched until it disappeared into the hills. Cattle moved in a far pasture. 2 horses watched from a paddock near the barn. The whole thing had the look of a place that had been built to last. This is it, Nathan said. 400 acres, 40 head, 3 hired men. He paused. It's not what you're used to. I'm used to a farm in Ontario, Harriet said. This looks like a farm in Alberta. I imagine I'll manage. He said nothing. But when he helped her down from the wagon, his grip was firm and certain, and he let go as soon as she had her footing, and she thought that small thing told her more than an hour of conversation might have. The house was clean and spare, functional in the way a tool is functional. Everything where it needed to be, nothing extra. No curtains, no rugs, a kitchen that worked and a parlor nobody sat in, a staircase up to 4 bedrooms, one of which now had fresh linens on the bed. Someone had made an effort there. Harriet touched the folded edge of the blanket and tried not to read too much into it. The morning after she arrived, she woke before dawn and came down to find the stove already burning and a note on the table in that spare, ink-conserving handwriting. Coffee's in the tin. I'm in the barn until 7. Don't feel obligated to cook until you've had time to learn the stove. N. She made breakfast anyway. The stove was temperamental and ran hot, and she burned the first batch of biscuits completely, standing over the wreckage, feeling the particular humiliation of having tried to prove herself and produce charcoal. She was scraping the pan into the waste bucket when small footsteps appeared in the kitchen doorway. A girl of 8 stood watching her. She had Nathan's coloring, that gray-green, watchful gaze, and her hair was in 2 braids that had been done carefully and were already coming undone. She looked at the burned biscuits, then at Harriet, with the forensic honesty of a child who has not yet learned to pretend. Those don't look good, she said. No, Harriet agreed. They don't. The stove and I are still negotiating. The girl considered this. Pa says the stove has a temper. Your pa's right. Harriet looked at her. You must be Rosie. Rosie Greer. The girl's chin came up slightly, as if stating something that mattered. You're the one from Ontario. I am. Rosie crossed to the kitchen table and sat down, elbows on wood, watching. You can try again if you want. I'll tell you when the smell changes. That's how you know it's about to burn. Harriet looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. That would help. They made the second batch together. Rosia perched on the step stool her father had built her, narrating the smell with the seriousness of a scientist. When Nathan came in from the barn and found them pulling a golden pan from the oven, flour on both their sleeves, he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that had something undone about it, like a knot coming loose. He didn't say anything. He poured himself coffee and sat down and ate 3 biscuits in silence.
Then he said, "These are good." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was better than that. It was a verdict.
The ranch hands accepted her, with the casual wariness of men who had learned not to assume.
There were 3 of them.
Emmett, who was 50 and had been with Nathan for 12 years, and spoke rarely and always usefully. Cord, who was 20 and watched Harriet with the sideways curiosity of someone trying to assess a new variable in a familiar equation. And Walt, who was 63 and walked with a limp from a horse injury, and whose opinion of everything was delivered in exactly 4 words or fewer. By the end of the first week, Walt had said 6 words to her total, which Emmett told her was practically a conversation. She found her footing in the work. She had expected to feel lost, and some days she did, standing in the middle of a house that had the bones of a home but not the warmth, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. But the work itself was something she understood. The rhythms of cooking and preserving and managing a household, applied now at a different scale in a different landscape. She was not helpless here. She was learning. There was a difference. What surprised her was Nathan. He was not what she'd expected.
She had expected closed, and he was, in certain ways, there were walls in him she could feel the edges of without being able to see over them. But he was also precise and fair and quietly observant in ways that made her feel unexpectedly visible.
He noticed when she'd reorganized the kitchen storage.
He mentioned it not as criticism, but as acknowledgement.
He asked her opinion on whether the root cellar needed expanding before winter, and listened when she answered. He treated her like someone whose thoughts were worth consulting. Nobody in her life had ever done that quite so consistently. The town of Milford Creek was 11 miles away and had the self-important energy of a small place that has decided it matters.
The general store.
A church. A school where Rosie attended 3 days a week. A hotel with a dining room that doubled as the social hub for anyone with enough time and opinion to fill it. The first Sunday she attended church, the women of Milford Creek formed an opinion of Harriet Bole in approximately 4 minutes and spent the next 30 confirming it. She watched them catalog her, the plain face, the practical dress, the hands that were already betraying that she'd been working rather than sitting decoratively in her new home.
The rector's wife, Mrs.
Aldborough, greeted her with the specific warmth of a woman who has decided to be charitable about something she finds disappointing. "You must be Nathan's wife."
How wonderful that he found someone. She paused just a breath too long, all the way from Ontario.
"I am," Harriet said pleasantly.
"It's a beautiful part of the country, isn't it?" Mrs. Aldborough's eyes did a quick survey. "It must be quite an adjustment. Every worthwhile thing requires adjustment."
The woman blinked, then smiled, recalibrating.
"Yes, I suppose so."
Harriet excused herself and found the one exterior wall where she could breathe cold air and think clearly. A voice came from beside her almost immediately. "They mean well, most of them. They're just bored." Harriet turned.
A woman about her own age, compact and direct in the way of someone who has decided efficiency is a moral value, extended a hand. "Lenora Fitch, I run the telegraph office." She said it the way some people say I run a country, with absolute ownership and zero apology. "Harriet Greer," Harriet said, and found it strange and not entirely uncomfortable to say. "I know who you are." Lenora crossed her arms against the cold. "I also know what they're saying about you. The mail-order bride." Nathan's consolation prize. "That's unkind." "It is." Lenora's expression didn't soften.
But unkind things are usually said clearly enough that you can deal with them. It's the kind things wrapped around a knife that cause the real damage.
She looked at Harriet. "You're going to be fine. You have good eyes." "What does that mean?" "It means you actually look at things."
Half the people in this town have never looked at anything past their own front fence.
She uncrossed her arms. "Come by the telegraph office sometime. I could use someone sensible to talk to." It was not a warm welcome. It was an honest one, and Harriet had learned to prefer those.
Nathan noticed the church had not been comfortable for her. He didn't ask directly. On the ride home with Rosie asleep on the wagon seat between them, he said, "You don't have to go every Sunday if you'd rather not."
"Is that an option?" "Everything's an option."
He kept his eyes on the road.
"I won't make you perform respectability for people who haven't earned it." She looked at him then, trying to read the profile of a man who chose his words the way some people chose tools, for function, for fit, for what they could actually do. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. "If you're willing to say." He was quiet for a while.
Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer.
"Her name was Elspeth," he said finally. "She came from Calgary. Good family, good education. She'd never been anywhere the wind didn't stop." He watched the road. The winters took something from her every year. She started disappearing a little at a time, got quiet and then quieter, and then one February she got sick and she didn't fight it.
He said it without accusation, with the exhausted flatness of a man who has already spent years being angry about it and put the anger down somewhere.
I think she'd stopped wanting to be here long before she died. I just didn't see it until it was too late. I'm sorry, Harriet said. I'm telling you so you know that I won't make the same mistakes. He looked at her briefly. If you're unhappy here, I want you to tell me. Directly. Not disappear into the silence.
She thought about that for the rest of the ride. She was not Elspeth. She had known the first morning she woke to that massive sky pressing in through the window and felt not suffocated but expanded, like there was suddenly more room to exist than she'd ever been given before. The landscape asked nothing of her appearance. The wind didn't care about her unmarried years. The cattle certainly did not have opinions about her jaw. She was useful here. More than useful. She was beginning to matter. November arrived with a cold that had intent behind it. Lenora stopped by the ranch one Thursday with a piece of information that she delivered the way she did everything. Directly, no ornament. Cecil Drummond is buying up land. Harriet knew the name.
The man who owned the largest spread south of Milford Creek,
and had the manner of someone who considered the whole region to be property he simply hadn't paid for yet. What kind of buying up? The kind where he calls in favors owed to the bank and then shows up with an offer 6 weeks later. Lenora set her mug on the kitchen table. He's done it to 3 properties already. Morrison sold in September, the Hallett brothers the month before. She looked at Harriet steadily. Nathan's water license ties into Drummond's southern boundary. He's been wanting that access for 2 years. Nathan doesn't know? Nathan doesn't read the bank correspondence closely enough. Lenora's expression was not quite judgment, but adjacent to it. He's a man who trusts that things will be fair. In my experience, that trust costs you eventually. Harriet spent the afternoon going through the paperwork Nathan kept in the wooden box in his study. She was not snooping, she was assessing. There was a difference between privacy and useful blindness. What she found confirmed what Lenora had suggested. A banknote, not overdue but not comfortable either. A water license dispute 3 years old and never fully resolved. The kind of vulnerable edges that a man like Drummond would know how to find and pull. She raised it with Nathan that evening after Rosie was in bed. She put the papers on the table between them and said, I need you to look at these with me. He looked at her rather than the papers first. His jaw had that set quality it had when he was deciding something. He sat down. They worked until midnight. Nathan understood the land side of it intuitively, knew every boundary, every survey marker, every historical quirk of the water access. Harriet understood the paperwork side, the language contracts used to obscure what they actually meant, the clauses that mattered and the ones that were decoration. Together, they could see the whole picture.
Who told you to look?
Nathan asked around 11 o'clock. Lenora Fitch. He absorbed that. She has sharper eyes than half the lawyers in Calgary.
She does. Harriet folded a document carefully. We need to file a clarification on the water license before Drummond can move on it. And we need to talk to someone at the bank. We, he repeated. Not you as instruction. As question. This is my home too, she said. Now. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. His expression did something complicated that she was only beginning to learn to read. Then he put his hand briefly over hers on the stack of papers, not a gesture of romance, of solidarity, and said, All right.
She rode into town with him the next morning. At the bank, a man named Parkins, who smiled the way Drummond's hired men probably smiled, pleasantly and with purpose, informed Nathan that the note schedule had been adjusted and that it was really nothing to worry about. Harriet set a counteroffer on the table before Nathan could respond to the reassurance.
She had drafted it the previous evening in the clear language she'd developed
for exactly the kind of situation where pleasantness is the weapon. Parkins read it. His smile adjusted.
We'll need to review this with our head office. Of course, Harriet said. We'll wait. They did not wait long.
Cecil Drummond came to the ranch himself 2 weeks later. He was the physical embodiment of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. Broad, silver-templed, wearing a coat that had been made in Calgary or perhaps further east, with the easy authority of someone accustomed to transactions going his way. He addressed Nathan entirely. Standing in the yard, hat in hand with the performance of courtesy, he made his offer to the man while Harriet stood beside him.
I'd be willing to be very generous, Drummond said, given the circumstances.
He let the word circumstances carry everything he meant by it. The banknote, the water dispute, the general vulnerability of a widower with a young daughter and a mail-order wife who'd arrived from Ontario 3 months ago.
The circumstances are better than they appear, Harriet said.
Drummond turned to her with the slight recalibration of a man who had not expected a response from that direction.
Mrs. Greer, the water license has been clarified and filed. Harriet kept her voice pleasant and her expression neutral.
The banknote has been rescheduled on terms that suit us, and we have documentation going back 18 years that establishes continuous use of that Southern Creek access.
She let the pause breathe.
So you see, the circumstances that brought you here today are not quite the circumstances you expected to find. Something moved in Drummond's face. The easy authority flattened slightly, like a man reaching for a door handle that was no longer where he'd left it.
This is a family decision, he said, looking at Nathan. It is, Nathan said, and my family has made it.
He looked at Drummond with the gray-green calm of a man standing on ground he has worked for 20 years.
We're not selling.
Drummond put his hat back on. He smiled. These things have a way of resolving themselves in time, he said, and rode away with the slow pace of someone who wants you to believe he wasn't in a hurry to begin with. Nathan watched until he was over the ridge. Then he said, "Where did you learn to talk like that?"
Like what?
Like you'd already won before anyone knew there was a fight. Harriet thought about it. My father used to say that the woman who appears to need nothing is more dangerous than the one who appears to want everything. Nathan's mouth did the thing it did when it almost became a smile.
You're full of surprises, Miss Bole.
Harriet Greer, she corrected. He looked at her then, and something in the look was different from every look that had come before it. Less assessment, more recognition, as if he were seeing her precisely rather than approximately for the first time.
Yes, he said, you are.
Drummond was not finished. He was the kind of man who had learned to work through intermediaries when direct approaches failed. Over the next 3 weeks, small things went wrong on the ranch in the ways that were individually explainable and collectively unlikely. A fence line cut, 3 cattle let out of the north pasture, a delivery of winter feed delayed at the supplier in town because of a paperwork question no one could specify exactly.
Nathan took it with the grim patience of a man who has survived before and knows he will have to again. Harriet took it differently. She started writing things down, dates, times, descriptions.
She talked to Emmett, who had been watching the valley for 12 years and had a long memory. She talked to Lenora, who knew everyone's business through the telegraph lines and was willing to share when the cause was just. She gathered. The moment of confrontation, when it came, was nothing like she'd expected.
She was at the general store in Milford Creek on a Wednesday afternoon when Drummond came in with 2 of his hired men, not to do anything exactly, just to be seen, to let the town absorb the fact of his presence and draw its own conclusions about who held weight here. He saw her.
He smiled.
How are you settling in, Mrs. Greer? Still finding everything you expected?
More than I expected, she said.
He moved closer, lowered his voice to the register that men use when they want to have a private conversation in a public space.
You're a sensible woman, I can see that. So I'll speak to you sensibly.
Nathan is a good man, but a stubborn one. He'll hold on to that ranch until the ground swallows him and leave his daughter with nothing but the debt. You could convince him to be practical. He was using her own descriptor against her. She felt it like a hand around a wrist. She said, Mr.
Drummond, I moved 1,400 kilometers from everything I knew to build something with a man I'd never met. I have burned my hands on a stove that doesn't like me, pulled calves in the dark, kept books for an operation that tried to bury itself under its own paperwork, and learned to read a weather front by watching how the horses stand.
She held his gaze. I am exactly as practical as you think I am, and not in the way you mean.
He stared at her. The 2 hired men behind him had gone very quiet. The man behind the counter, who Harriet had said a total of 40 words to in 3 months, started quietly restocking a shelf near the door in the focused way of someone who has decided to remember this conversation later. That ranch, Harriet said, is not available. Not today, not when you've maneuvered the bank, not when you've cut our fences. We know what you've been doing, and we have it documented.
So I would suggest that your next practical decision is a different piece of land, because this one already has a family on it and we are not leaving.
She picked up her purchases and walked out. Her legs were trembling by the time she reached the wagon. She sat in the driver's seat for a full 2 minutes with her hands flat on her thighs before she trusted herself to hold the reins. Then she drove home through the November cold, past the foothills that kept unfolding into more of themselves, under a sky that had gone the color of iron, and felt something settle in her chest that had never quite settled before. Nathan heard the story from Lenora before Harriet had finished unhitching the horses.
He was waiting for her in the yard. She tried to preempt it. You heard. Lenora has the telegraph and a gift for narrative. He fell into step beside her. Are you all right?
I'm fine, Harriet. She stopped, turned to face him.
The cold was extraordinary, pressing in from all sides, and she could see her breath and his breath and the mountains behind him going pink at their peaks in the failing light. She was shaking slightly, adrenaline finally releasing its grip. I was frightened, she said. I want to be honest about that. But I meant everything I said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quiet and direct, I know.
He touched her face briefly with the back of his hand, the way you might check a temperature, except that was not quite what it was. Her breath caught. "Come inside," he said. "Rosie's been asking for you since she got home from school. What does she want? Help with her arithmetic." He started toward the house. Apparently her pa is useless at fractions. Harriet followed him and was surprised to find herself laughing. Winter arrived the way winters in Alberta do, without pretending it might still be otherwise. The first real storm came on a Tuesday and did not apologize for itself.
Harriet had prepared.
The root cellar was stocked, the storm windows were in, the wood was cut and covered, and she had read enough about foothills weather to understand that it did not negotiate. They were inside for 4 days. Nathan, Harriet, Rosie, and the quiet of a house that was learning to be something other than empty. On the second day, Rosie climbed onto the kitchen stool and watched Harriet make bread and said, out of nowhere, in the direct way children say things that cost them something, "My ma didn't like it here." Harriet kept working the dough. "I heard that it was hard for her. She used to cry when the wind was loud." Rosie's voice was careful, factual, covering something. Pa couldn't make her stop. He'd just sit with her. He used to sit with her all night sometimes. That sounds like something a good father does. "Is she why you came? Because we needed someone?" Harriet stopped and turned to face her. "I came because I needed something too." She found Rosie's gray-green eyes and held them. "I wasn't happy where I was. I felt like nobody could really see me." She paused, and I thought maybe somewhere else there'd be room to be someone worth seeing. Rosie thought about this with the slow seriousness she applied to all significant problems. "I think you're worth seeing," she said. "You're the only person who's ever let me crack eggs without arguing about the shell pieces." Harriet laughed. "The real kind, from somewhere unguarded. You're also," Rosie added, "very good at fractions." Nathan appeared in the doorway from the hall, where he had clearly been standing for some portion of the conversation. He had the look of a man who has heard something that has rearranged something internal and is still in the process of adjusting to the new arrangement. He said, "I thought I smelled bread." "It'll be another hour," Harriet said. He moved into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and the three of them were quiet together for a while, and it was not the empty quiet of a house where people had stopped trying. It was something else entirely. Drummond filed an objection to the water license through a solicitor in Calgary in January. It was the move of a man who had run out of direct approaches but was not ready to stop. Nathan's response was to hire a lawyer of their own, a woman named Price who arrived from Edmonton with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she had won arguments in worse weather than this. Harriet worked with her on the documentation. 4 evenings at the kitchen table, cross-referencing surveys and use records and correspondence going back to the original land grant. She had found in Nathan's wooden box a letter from a Dominion surveyor dated 1891 that described the creek access in language that was almost laughably clear on the question of who held right to it. Miss Price held it up to the lamp when Harriet found it. "Where did you get this?" "The wooden box in the study." "Has Nathan read everything in that box?" Harriet considered. "He knows it exists." She paused. "I don't think he expected to need it." Miss Price allowed herself something that was almost a smile. "Well, this changes things. The legal process moved at the speed legal processes move, which is to say slowly and with significant paperwork, but it moved in the right direction. By February, the solicitor in Calgary had gone quiet. By March, Drummond had bought the Jessup property 20 miles to the east, and the people in Milford Creek who had been watching to see which way the situation resolved itself began to resolve their opinions in a direction that suited Harriet rather better than before. On the last Sunday in March, Mrs. Aldborough stopped Harriet after the service and said, with the careful sincerity of a woman revising an earlier position, "I understand you had quite a difficult winter." Harriet said, "I've had worse," which was not entirely true but was the kind of thing that closed a conversation cleanly. Lenora was waiting for her outside. She looked like she'd been waiting to say something for some time. "They're calling you capable now." She said it as if reporting an absurdity. "Is that not what they were saying before?" "Before, they were saying practical." Lenora's expression was precise. Capable is a compliment. Practical is what you say about a kitchen table. Harriet thought about her mother's voice in the parlor. Harriet's always been so terribly practical. She found she didn't mind the revision. Spring came to the foothills like an argument finally conceded. Snow retreating, light returning in longer installments, the cattle moving with more ease, the whole land loosening its grip on itself. Harriet's garden, a modest ambition she'd started in March under glass, began to produce evidence that it intended to live. Rosie had started calling her something new. Not Harriet, not Mrs. Greer, just Ma, the same way she'd call for her father, casual, certain, as if the word were an old habit rather than a new one. The first time she said it, Harriet had gone very still and waited to see if the feeling it produced would pass. It didn't. Nathan heard her say it one evening in April.
He didn't comment. But later, after Rosie was asleep,
He came and sat across from Harriet at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and the look of a man who has decided to say something he has been carrying for a while.
I need to tell you something, he said. All right, when I placed that advertisement, he said, I wasn't expecting much.
He wrapped his hands around his cup. I thought I'd find someone willing to come and I'd provide fairly for them and we'd manage. He paused. A functional arrangement.
I wasn't trying for more than that. I know, she said. You've given us more than that.
He met her eyes. More than I knew how to ask for. More than I thought this place could hold after Elspeth.
Harriet said, I didn't come here to be a consolation prize.
I know, he said again. That's not what I mean. He set the cup down. He had the expression of a man not accustomed to saying difficult, true things out loud, working at it anyway. What I mean is that I made a practical arrangement, and somewhere in the middle of it I stopped thinking of it as practical.
And I don't know how to tell you that
without sounding like I've broken the terms of something. She looked at him in the lamplight in the kitchen that she had learned to manage and slowly turned into a place that felt like it meant what homes were supposed to mean. Nathan, she said. He waited. I don't think an arrangement stops being what it was just because it becomes something more.
She held his gaze. I think sometimes you begin with honesty, and the honesty goes somewhere you didn't plan for, and that's not a breach. That's just what honest things do.
His expression did the thing it had been learning to do, loosening, opening, becoming something she could read more clearly every week.
He said, Harriet Bole. Harriet Greer, she corrected, for the second time, and this time they were both smiling. He stood up and crossed to her side of the table, and she stood, and he kissed her once, deliberately, with the same care he put into everything.
Not impulsive, not performative, but chosen. When they separated, she said, that was a long time coming.
I know, he said. I'm slow. You're careful. He looked at her. Yes.
He put his forehead against hers for a moment.
There's a difference.
Summer arrived with the kind of uncomplicated beauty the Alberta foothills produce when they decide to try. The ranch had its best season since Nathan had taken it over.
The water license was settled definitively in their favor by a judge in Calgary who appeared to have no patience for old letters and surveys being relitigated through expensive solicitors. Drummond did not send congratulations.
Rosie grew 3/4 of an inch and lost 2 teeth and developed strong opinions about which of the calves deserved names. Harriet taught school 3 mornings a week when the regular teacher was ill, which turned into every morning, which turned into an understanding with the town council that she would take over the position properly in the fall. Nathan told her the night she came home and said she'd agreed to it, "You're going to run out of hours. I've been efficient with hours since I was 12, she said. I'll manage." He shook his head, but his expression was not concerned. It was something else, admiring, she thought, and tried not to think about it too long because it still caught her slightly off guard, the fact of being looked at that way, by anyone. The summer social in Milford Creek was held in August, in the schoolyard, because the church hall was being repainted. Harriet wore a dress Lenora had helped her find. Nothing elaborate, just well-made and the right color, a blue that was neither trying too hard nor giving up. She stood on the edge of the gathering with a cup of lemonade and watched the town in its August mood, easier and louder than it was in winter, and felt with a precision that surprised her that she belonged here.
Not because the town had decided to accept her, though it largely had.
Not because she'd proven something to the women who'd whispered that first Sunday, though she had.
But because she had built something real in this place.
Something that was hers in the specific way that things are yours when you've worked for them and chosen them, and stayed when staying was hard. Nathan appeared at her elbow. Rosie's won 3 consecutive races against children 2 years older than her, he said, and sounds insufferable about it. She gets that from you. He looked at her sideways.
I'm not insufferable. You're very sure of yourself when you've solved a problem.
He considered this. That might be fair. He offered her his arm, an unusual gesture for a man who was not naturally given to public sentiment, and she took it and they stood together watching Rosie lap the other children in a 4th race, and Harriet thought that this was the thing she hadn't been able to picture when she'd walked to the postbox at midnight.
Not a grand reversal, not a transformation, but this, standing in the right place next to the right people at last.
Autumn came and the mountains did what mountains in Alberta do in autumn, which is to become so extraordinarily beautiful that you feel slightly accused by them.
Harriet's garden had produced enough to fill half the root cellar.
The cattle were moved to the near pastures. The school term began in her classroom, which she had spent 2 weekends making legible and warm, filled with children who arrived skeptical and left, most days slightly less so. On a cold October evening, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off the train at Milford Creek into the opinion of that wind, Harriet sat at the kitchen table after Rosie was asleep and wrote a letter to her mother. She had written before, short factual letters documenting that she was alive and managing.
This one was different. She wrote about the ranch and the town and Lenora and Rosie
And the way the foothills looked in October light, and somewhere in the middle of the letter she wrote,
I think I've become someone I didn't know I was allowed to be. I came here to escape being invisible and found out I never was. I was just in the wrong place, looking at myself through the wrong eyes.
She paused, then added,
I wish you could see it. I think you'd understand now why I had to go.
Nathan found her there when he came in late from checking the stock. He looked at the letter without reading it.
Who are you writing to, my mother?
He poured water from the kettle, set a cup in front of her without being asked. Is it a good letter or a hard one? Both, she said. He sat across from her. That's usually the sign it's the right one. They were quiet for a moment in the kitchen that was warm and theirs and smelled of the bread she'd made that morning.
Can I ask you something? Harriet said. You can ask me anything. She looked at him. The year of learning to read his face had given her access to it now, in a way that still sometimes felt like an extraordinary privilege. Do you think we're going to be all right?
Nathan put his cup down. He had the expression he wore when he was deciding to say something true rather than something comfortable.
I think, he said, we're going to be better than all right. I think we're already better than all right. He looked at her steadily. I think the hard part was you getting here. And you did that.
She thought about the midnight walk to the post box, the train through the prairies, the burned biscuits, the fence lines cut in the night, the counteroffer on the bank table, the afternoon in the general store when her legs wouldn't stop shaking for 20 minutes after.
Yes, she said, I did.
Outside, the October wind moved through the foothills, with the settled certainty of something that has been doing this for 1,000 years and intends to continue. Inside, the lamp made the kitchen warm, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of a place where the people in it have stopped bracing themselves.
Harriet Bole had come to Alberta because her cousin laughed at her,
because her mother called her practical in the tone of an apology, because she had 26 years of being invisible, and enough left in her to want otherwise. She had not arrived knowing who she was here. She had found that out in the working of it, in burned biscuits and water licenses, and the way a child's hand finds yours without asking permission, in a man who had learned to mean things and said them anyway. She had not become someone new. She had simply become at last and without apology herself, and that, it turned out, was more than enough.